It was 5:30 a.m. in the quiet, affluent neighborhood of Marston Hills, San Diego. The world was still asleep until two gunshots shattered the stillness. Inside a stately home on Cypress Avenue, one of California's most successful lawyers lay bleeding next to his young wife. And standing in the doorway, motionless, almost calm, was the woman he had once promised forever. What drove a picture-perfect housewife to pull the trigger that morning would leave the nation searching for answers for years to come. Welcome to True Crime Wound, where we uncover the real stories behind America's darkest crimes. Today's story is one of love, ambition, betrayal, and the slow burn of revenge. The Betty Broderick revenge story. A marriage built on ambition, shattered by betrayal, and a woman pushed beyond her breaking point. Elizabeth Ann Bisheglia, known later as Betty Broderick, was born in 1947 in Brooklyn, New York. Raised in a strict Irish Catholic family, Betty's life was built on three unshakable pillars: faith, family, and obedience. She was taught from a young age that a woman's success wasn't measured by her career, but by her ability to build a perfect home. Her father was a successful building contractor, her mother a homemaker who embodied every virtue the church admired: patience, devotion, and silence. Betty learned early: you don't complain, you endure. At Marymount College, she carried those lessons with her, quiet, polite, and determined to find the kind of man her parents would approve of. And in 1965, she did. That's when Betty met Daniel T. Broderick III. Dan was charming, tall, and ambitious, a Notre Dame medical student from a well-off family. He was everything Betty's parents could have hoped for. And to Betty, he represented the American dream in motion, a man with drive, class, and a future full of promise. Their connection was instant, intense, and undeniable from the very beginning. From their very first meeting at a Notre Dame campus event, Betty and Dan were drawn to each other's energy. He admired her warmth, her laughter, and the way she carried herself with quiet confidence. She was impressed by his ambition, his charm, and his clear sense of direction. They began spending long evenings talking about the future, his dreams of becoming both a doctor and a lawyer, her hopes of building a loving home filled with children. Friends remembered seeing them walking hand in hand across campus, sharing coffee between classes, studying together in quiet corners of the library. Betty often said that Dan made her feel seen in a way no one else had before. Dan, on the other hand, found in Betty a partner who believed in his potential completely. She encouraged his goals, wrote him letters of support, and never doubted that he was destined for success. Their romance was built not just on attraction, but on shared ambition, a vision of a life they would build together. They spent holidays with each other's families, where Betty's parents saw Dan as the perfect match: polite, Catholic, and driven. Dan's family admired Betty's grace and kindness, welcoming her as though she were already part of their own. Their bond deepened quickly. They were best friends as much as lovers, finishing each other's sentences, laughing over small things, dreaming big together. Dan often promised Betty that one day, all their sacrifices would pay off, that they would live a life others could only imagine. By 1969, those dreams seemed within reach. Their wedding photos painted a perfect picture: Betty in lace, smiling beside her husband in his crisp suit. But even then, beneath the glow of youth and promise, their lives were already on a collision course. They started a family almost immediately. Betty gave birth to their first child while Dan was still in graduate school. He earned his medical degree, then a law degree from Harvard, determined to specialize in medical malpractice. Betty, meanwhile, became the backbone of their young family, juggling pregnancies, bills, and dreams deferred. She worked odd jobs, sold Avon, rented out rooms, anything to keep the family afloat while Dan climbed the professional ladder. To the outside world, She was the ideal wife, supportive, beautiful, endlessly patient. But behind the smiles, Betty was already losing pieces of herself. As Dan's career took off, so did his confidence and distance. He bought expensive suits, joined country clubs, and built a law practice in San Diego that quickly became one of the most successful in the state. Betty had helped him get there, but the more successful he became, the more invisible she felt. She had followed the rules. She had done everything she was told a good wife should do. Yet somehow her dream life was no longer hers. And then, in the early 1980s, a name entered their lives that would change everything: Linda Kolkina. Linda was young, vibrant, and effortlessly charming, the kind of woman who could light up a room without trying. A former flight attendant with Delta Airlines, she was confident, outspoken, and carried a playful sense of humor that people naturally gravitated toward. She first crossed paths with Dan at the courthouse in San Diego, where she worked as a receptionist. Dan, by then one of the city's most respected medical malpractice attorneys, often visited the courthouse for filings and meetings. Their interactions started out casual, friendly smiles, short exchanges, small talk about work and life. But Linda's personality stood out. She was bold where Betty had been cautious, spontaneous where Betty had been measured. Dan, who had spent years immersed in a life of strict schedules, court cases, and social expectations, found Linda's carefree attitude refreshing. She laughed easily, spoke without hesitation, and treated him not like a superior attorney, but like an equal, something that fed both his ego and his growing desire for freedom. What began as professional politeness soon grew into flirtation. Linda would drop by his office to deliver messages personally, linger during conversations, and laugh at his jokes a little longer than necessary. Dan, who had grown distant and emotionally detached at home, started looking forward to her visits. He admired her energy, her youth, and the way she seemed genuinely interested in him, not for his money or status, but for who he was when he wasn't playing the role of Attorney Dan Broderick. Before long, Dan offered her a position at his law firm, despite her lack of secretarial training and the objections of his colleagues. Officially, she became his legal assistant. Unofficially, she became the person who filled the emotional space Betty once held. They began working closely. Late nights at the office, private meetings under the pretense of case reviews, business trips that blurred into something more personal. Dan confided in her about his frustrations at home, painting Betty as volatile and unreasonable. Linda, in turn, played the role of comforter, listener, and eventually, companion. To the outside world, it all appeared professional, a boss and his assistant, managing a thriving practice. But those who worked nearby noticed the growing familiarity, the inside jokes, the exchanged glances, the subtle touches that crossed the line between business and affection. When Dan began attending firm parties and social events with Linda by his side, the whispers turned into certainty. She wasn't just his assistant anymore. She was part of his life, and soon part of his future. In quiet moments, Dan would tell friends that Linda made him feel young again, that she understood him in a way Betty no longer did. He began imagining a new life, one free from the constant arguments and emotional chaos that had come to define his marriage. By the time Betty confronted him about the affair, the bond between Dan and Linda was already deep. They had plans, not openly spoken, but clear nonetheless. A shared home, a shared life, a fresh start. To Betty it was betrayal in its purest form, not just infidelity but replacement. The woman who had built Dan's success from the ground up had suddenly become invisible, watching from the sidelines as another woman stepped into the world she had sacrificed everything to create. And though Dan tried to justify his choices as a search for peace, what he failed to see was that the storm he was escaping was the one he helped create. The warmth that once filled their home had turned cold. Betty confronted Dan again and again. Each time he denied any affair, but her instincts told her otherwise. There were phone calls that went unanswered, rumors among friends, a birthday card that never came. And slowly Betty's anger began to build, not just at Dan, but at herself. Had she given up too much of her life for a man who no longer saw her? By 1985, the tension exploded. Dan moved out of their home, leaving Betty and the children behind. The divorce that followed would become one of the most vicious legal battles San Diego had ever seen. But before the chaos, before the courtroom and the headlines, there were two people who once loved each other deeply. Two people who built a life from nothing, only to destroy it piece by piece. Because sometimes the story of a murder doesn't begin with the crime itself. It begins with love, and what happens when that love turns to resentment. By the early 1980s, Dan Broderick was no longer just another attorney. He was one of San Diego's elite. He had power, respect, and the kind of lifestyle most people only dreamed of. But behind every great success story, there's often someone whose sacrifices made it possible. That someone was Betty. For nearly 2 decades, she had been his foundation, raising 4 children, managing their home, standing beside him through years of school, debt, and struggle. But as Dan's success grew, Betty's presence in his world began to fade. Dan became sharper, more distant. He demanded perfection from his work, his image, and his family. Betty, once the center of his attention, now felt like a prop in a life that wasn't hers anymore. Arguments became frequent, about money, about appearances, about control. Dan wanted order. Betty wanted acknowledgement. Neither wanted to surrender. Then came Linda Colcana. Phone calls went unanswered. Dan came home later, smelling of perfume that wasn't hers. When she confronted him, he denied everything. But she wasn't wrong. By 1983, the affair was no longer a rumor. Betty's anger exploded. She threw a stereo through Dan's door, vandalized his property, and left dozens of furious voicemails. Her rage was raw, unfiltered, the kind that comes from years of feeling dismissed. To some, she was unstable. To others, she was simply a woman betrayed beyond reason. Dan eventually moved out in 1985, taking the children with him. He used his legal influence to control the divorce proceedings, leaving Betty with little power and even less money. For years, she fought back through letters, phone calls, and desperate outbursts. It became one of the most bitter divorces in California's history. Dan, the powerful attorney. Betty, the ex-wife with no voice. A battle where love had long turned to hate. She left voicemails laced with profanity. She rammed her car into his front door. She was spiraling, and no one seemed to notice. The final divorce decree came in 1989, 4 years after Dan filed. Dan was granted the home, full custody of their children, and control of the finances. Betty was left with almost nothing. For Betty, it wasn't just a legal defeat. It was the erasure of everything she had built her life around. Dan remarried that same year to Linda Colcana. The wedding invitation had arrived, addressed simply to Elizabeth Broderick. No mention of Mrs., no sign of respect. To Betty, it felt like the final insult. She began to unravel completely. Her friends stopped answering the phone. Her children stopped visiting. Her anger became her only companion. And beneath it all, the thought that wouldn't go away, that Dan and Linda had won. November 5th, 1989. In the early hours before dawn, Betty got into her cream-colored Chevrolet Suburban and drove toward Dan's home in Marston Hills. In her purse was a .38 caliber revolver, one she had purchased months earlier. She parked quietly, used a key she had taken from her daughter weeks before, and stepped inside. The house was still. The sound of her own footsteps echoed through the dark hallway. Upstairs, Dan and Linda were asleep in their bed. What happened next lasted seconds. Betty entered the bedroom, raised the gun, and fired 5 shots. 2 bullets struck Linda, one fatally. Another hit Dan as he reached for the phone to call for help. The receiver fell from his hand, dangling as the line went dead. Moments later, Betty fled the house. She called her daughter, saying softly, "I just shot your father." When police arrived, they found Dan and Linda dead in their bed, and Betty sitting calmly in her car, waiting. She didn't deny it. In fact, when asked what happened, she simply said, "I did it. I couldn't take it anymore." The news broke before sunrise, headlines across the country reading, "Prominent attorney and wife shot dead." It was a story too bizarre, too emotional, too human to look away from. A housewife turned killer, a marriage turned battlefield, and a nation asking, how could this happen? The trial of Betty Broderick began in 1990, and almost immediately it became a media circus. Every network wanted the story. Every viewer had an opinion. Was she a victim of emotional abuse or a cold-blooded murderer? The prosecution painted Betty as calculated, a woman who planned her revenge and executed it without remorse. They showed the revolver, the key, the months of threats and outbursts. To them, this was not passion. This was premeditation. The defense told another story. They described a woman emotionally broken, stripped of her identity, gaslit by years of control, silenced by a legal system that favored her husband. They said Betty didn't kill out of hatred, but desperation. In the courtroom, Betty was unpredictable. One moment calm, even polite. The next, emotional, shouting, crying, shaking her head as prosecutors described the murders. To some jurors, she was sympathetic. To others, manipulative. The public couldn't look away. The first trial ended in a hung jury. The nation was divided. Half saw a victim, half saw a killer. But the second trial in 1991 sealed her fate. New evidence, stronger arguments, and a weary public ready for closure. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty on 2 counts of second-degree murder. Betty Broderick was sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. As she was led away, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply walked. Her head held high, the same posture she had held on her wedding day, decades before. And yet, as the doors closed behind her, one question lingered. Was justice truly served, or had the world just witnessed the final act of a tragedy that could have been prevented years earlier? When the gates of the California Institution for Women closed behind Betty Broderick, a chapter of American true crime closed with them. But outside those prison walls, her story was far from over. In the years that followed, Betty became something rare, a convicted murderer who remained a public fascination. Letters poured into the prison by the hundreds, from supporters who believed she had been pushed too far, and from critics who saw her as the embodiment of jealousy turned lethal. Inside, Betty adjusted to her new life. Gone were the elegant homes of La Jolla, the charity galas, the designer clothes. Her world was now measured in concrete, metal, and routine. She worked prison jobs, took educational courses, and occasionally spoke to the media, never with regret, but always with a sense of justification. When asked if she felt remorse, she said, "I feel terrible that my children lost both their parents, but I didn't plan it. It just happened." Even behind bars, Betty held her head high, the same way she always had. To some, it was strength, to others, denial. But either way, it kept her name alive. In 1992, her story became a national sensation again with the release of A Woman Scorned, the Betty Broderick Story. Meredith Baxter played Betty with haunting precision, and audiences were captivated. The movie became one of the most watched TV films of the decade, earning Golden Globe nominations and sparking endless debates. Was Betty a victim of a controlling husband, or was she the architect of her own destruction? The fascination didn't end there. Talk shows lined up for interviews. Oprah, 2020, hard copy. Betty spoke from behind glass, poised and articulate, often portraying herself as the wronged wife. A woman who gave everything, only to be replaced. Yet she rarely spoke of Dan or Linda as people, only as symbols of what had been taken from her. That detachment disturbed many who watched. It wasn't the anger that unsettled them. It was the calm. Years passed. Inmates came and went, but Betty stayed. In 2010, she faced her first parole hearing. When asked if she felt remorse, she said she'd done what she had to do. The board denied her release. 7 years later, in 2017, she tried again, and again was denied. The board cited her lack of insight and refusal to accept responsibility. Even in her 70s, Betty Broderick remained defiant. To the end, she insisted she was not a danger to society, that she was simply a woman who broke under unbearable pressure. Outside the prison walls, her legacy evolved. Some called her the original woman scorned, a tragic warning about emotional abuse and societal pressure. Others saw her as proof of entitlement, a woman who couldn't bear to lose control. When Dirty John, the Betty Broderick story, premiered in 2020, starring Amanda Peet and Christian Slater, a new generation rediscovered her story. Social media buzzed again. TikTok edits, YouTube documentaries, Reddit debates, all reigniting the same question from 1989. Was she justified or was she guilty beyond redemption? Betty's children, now grown, remain divided. Her eldest daughter, Kim, has spoken about forgiveness, not as approval, but as survival. Her son, Rhett, has said he believes his mother should one day be released, but he fears the anger that still burns within her. It's the ultimate tragedy, children forced to love a mother who killed their father. To forgive her means betraying his memory. To condemn her means abandoning their own. And so, even decades later, Betty Broderick remains one of the most polarizing women in American true crime, a symbol of heartbreak and fury, of a life that unraveled behind closed doors. But maybe her story isn't only about murder. Maybe it's about the expectations placed on women to be perfect wives, perfect mothers, perfect supporters, until the cracks begin to show. And maybe it's about what happens when someone's entire identity is built around someone else's success, and that foundation is ripped away. Because love, in its purest form, can uplift, but when twisted by pride, jealousy, and power, it can destroy. In the end, Betty Broderick's story isn't just about bullets fired in a dark bedroom. It's about emotional decay, the slow corrosion of trust, and the silence of resentment. And maybe that's why her case still haunts people, because beneath the courtroom drama, there's something uncomfortably human about it. How far can love bend before it breaks? When betrayal becomes unbearable, is it anger or heartbreak that takes over? And when someone loses everything they've lived for, what are they truly capable of? Perhaps the hardest truth about Betty Broderick is that in her reflection, some people see themselves, the loneliness, the desperation, the feeling of being unseen. But while most people fantasize about revenge, she lived it. And that choice became her prison long before the cell doors ever closed. Was Betty Broderick a victim of betrayal, or the architect of her own downfall? That's for you to decide. If you found this story compelling, subscribe to True Crime Wound. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe Betty Broderick deserves a second chance at freedom? Your perspective might just shape our next discussion. Coming up next on True Crime Wound, another real story where love turned lethal. and the truth proves stranger than fiction. Stay with us, because behind every perfect couple, there's a story the world never sees. True crime wound, real stories, real people, real consequences.